This is a 1985 Porsche 911, and it's a beloved automotive icon, the air-cooled 911, adored by legions of fans and enthusiasts, one of the most adored cars in the history of, well, cars. Today, I'm going to review this old-school air-cooled 911 Targa and show you all of its quirks and features, and I'll explain what all the fuss is about. Before I get started, big news, this 911 is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This is a desirable 911 Targa model finished in iconic Guards red with no major modifications, and it can be yours on Cars and Bids. So once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this 911 Targa, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right. Time for the quirks and features of the 80s air-cooled 911, starting with a little background. So, the Porsche 911, Porsche's flagship iconic sports car, first went on sale in the 1960s, and it was sold in the same basic form all the way through the late 90s. In 98, Porsche finally gave the car a full, complete, ground-up redesign. Now, throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and into the 90s, there were different versions and variations and changes that were made, but the original old-school air-cooled 911 kept its same basic design for all that time. This, however, is kind of the last version of the original 911. In 1989, Porsche thoroughly updated the car, kept the same basic underpinnings, but gave it new styling and available all-wheel drive and new technology. There were some big changes, and this car was really kind of the last one that had the original ethos from the very first 60s Porsche 911 way back in the day. And so that's a big reason why Porsche enthusiasts and purists absolutely love this car. The next iteration of the 911, although again it kept the same basic underpinnings, they added power steering, they finally changed the suspension design, the styling. It was a big difference from the original old school 911, and this was sort of the end of the run, the best of breed, and that's why people absolutely love this car so much, and they're so nostalgic for the iconic original 911 in what some consider to be sort of its final original iteration. And of course, a major reason why this car was so beloved, so adored, was its powertrain. A flat six, like the 911 virtually always had an air-cooled flat six. That is the Porsche 911, and frankly, it still is the Porsche 911 to this day. By 1985, the flat six was a 3.2-liter unit that made about 210 horsepower for the US market, although overseas European models got a little bit more power, around 235 horses. 0 to 60 in either case was in the low 6-second range. Not exactly fast by modern standards, but late 70s, early 80s, that made for a pretty quick car in this time period. And of course, it was air-cooled. Like I mentioned, that was a big distinguishing feature that made people love these cars. Porsche hadn't yet switched to the more modern technology of water cooling, and they wouldn't until the late 90s. This remains an old-school air-cooled 911, which was not only this analog kind of original feeling thing, but it helped give the car a distinctive sound that's sort of shared between all air-cooled Porsche 911 models and frankly air-cooled vehicles in general. Now, when it comes to quirks and features about this particular 911, probably the most notable quirk on the outside is the roof situation, because this 911 is a Targa model, which means it has a removable roof panel here. This central panel is vinyl and you can remove it. There's a couple of latches inside. It's pretty heavy. It's a little bit unwieldy and cumbersome, but you can take it off and enjoy an open air driving experience. The Targa was a very popular version of the 911 in this era, and it still is to this day. And a hallmark of 911 Targa models was this hoop that sort of goes behind the removable panel across the entire vehicle. That's still a hallmark of the Targa. And this curved piece of glass in back that went kind of from the side of the car to the rear to the other side. And again, that is still a hallmark of the 911 Targa. Now, interestingly, this car was also offered as a full convertible or as a full coupe. And the Targa was sort of an in-between version if that's what you wanted. A lot of automakers created Targa-topped vehicles like this one in the late 1970s and the early 80s because there had been rumors that the US government was going to create regulations banning full convertibles, deeming them unsafe. And so automakers that relied heavily on convertible sales tried to figure out sort of a different alternative, and that was the Targa Top, which was developed for a lot of vehicles in this period. Now, the US government never actually put those regulations into place. Convertibles were never actually banned. And so for a lot of cars, the Targa kind of came and went. But for the 911, it remained and still remains a popular body style and kind of a hallmark feature of some 911 models. And speaking of US government regulations, another major striking visual component of 911 models from this era would be the bumpers, which, as you can see, are rather large and rather protruding from the body of the car. Not only do the bumpers stick out a few inches beyond the body, but then they have these giant black plastic panels on the back that stick out like another 6 inches to provide even more bumpering capabilities. And you had these rubber kind of accordion looking things on the side of the car that helped drive home the visual message of the bumper, which I guess was that it could be bumped. Now, these bumpers largely came into play again due to US regulations around how tough and how strong bumpers had to be, regulations that are largely still in place. In the 80s, though, when those regulations showed up, the automakers hadn't designed the vehicles to cope, so they just kind of added bumpers to the outside of existing designs. Later cars, of course, the bumper design was integrated into the overall design, but when they had to just add it to an existing car, this is what you ended up with. And of course, this is US market only stuff. European models from this era, Porsche 911s and a lot of other cars, had much less drastic bumpers than what you see here. And next up, another distinctive element on the outside of this car, the wheels. These were Porsche's Fuchs wheels, and they were on 911 models for many, many years, decades even. In this era, they were painted black in the center, as you can see, and the rim or the lip on the outside is left silver. And that was kind of a hallmark of 911 models from the 80s. Various other versions of this wheel were painted in various different configurations depending on the time period of the car, but this is what you had in this time, and it's a very distinctive element combined with all the other stuff that made an 80s 911 look the way it does. But while the exterior of this car is pretty well covered territory, most enthusiasts know what these look like and why, the interior is much more mysterious and downright bizarre and certainly quirky. And so we get in here and begin with the door panel, which certainly has some interesting quirks. How about, for example, this large circle on the door panel? Is that the power window? No, it's the lock. You twist it and it will lock the door. You twist it the other way and it will unlock. And we are off to the races with the weird stuff on the door panel. Another one, the power window switches. You can see there two, but they're mounted in a line, not next to each other to correspond to the window's position of the car. So which controls which window? Well, you just kind of had to know. I have always loved the door panel storage situation where you have two door pocket storage compartments. One is open, you can put stuff in there. The other actually has a lid. You open it up and put stuff in there, and then you can close the lid so you can keep things out of reach of prying eyes. An odd unlabeled item on the door panel is actually the latch to get out. Where is that located? It's right here. You pull on this, just looks like a trim panel, but actually it's the door latch. You pull on it, it opens the door and you can climb out. But undoubtedly the very strangest thing on the driver's door panel is the power mirror control. You can see it's mounted up here and it's a little joystick, but this is only controlling the passenger side mirror, which makes no sense because it's mounted right next to the driver's side mirror, but it only controls one until you discover that you can adjust which mirror is being controlled using this unlabeled switch located under the gauge cluster. You switch it to the other side and then you're controlling the mirror on the other side inside of the car. The switch is not near the power mirror switch, and it doesn't say what it does. You just kind of have to know. And indeed, that's a bit of a hallmark of this car, because there's a lot of bizarre stuff in this interior that you just kind of have to know. Let's start with the climate controls. Some of them are here in the center console. This adjusts like the fan speed, and the window defogger. Okay, but there's more climate controls than that. You go further down, and mounted on the top of the center console, you have these two dials. This adjusts your air conditioning. I guess your fan speed, you can change the air conditioning here. That's totally separate from your other climate controls. But then you have yet another climate control, and that is this dial between the seats that allows you to switch between cool, middle, or hot air, depending on what you're looking for. And that's yet another climate control positioned in yet another spot. So climate controls are sort of strewn about throughout the interior of this car. And by the way, speaking of the climate controls, the vents, the climate control vents, are the smallest you will ever see in your entire life. The center ones are mounted right here. They're a little on the small side, but the side ones are unbelievably tiny, mounted at the edges of the dashboard. You can see they're about the size of a pinky, maybe even smaller, but I guess that was all you needed to cool or heat this interior. And the weirdness continues. Let's go back to those center air conditioning controls. You can see in between the two climate dials here, you have a different dial, and that's for sound location, where you want the speakers in the front or in the rear. Why is it positioned there? We'll never know. Just below that, you have a little button with a key on it. That's your power lock button. You press that when the doors are locked, it lights up, so it backlights the key, letting you know that indeed your doors are locked. Kind of quirky, but that's how they did it. Now, one very straightforward thing in this car is the gauges. You can see the gauge cluster, 5 separate gauges with the tachometer right in the center, all around here. They're very straightforward, very simple, but even these functional gauges have some quirks. Like, for example, when you turn on the headlights, the little warning light on the gauge that lets you know the headlight is on is positioned on the speedometer between 80 and 100 miles an hour. That's where they've put it. And strangely enough, that is exactly where it's basically impossible to see it if you're sitting in the driver's seat. It is positioned directly behind the steering wheel rim. Now, the gauges also have an unusual warning light. This little arrow, when it's illuminated, is an upshift light, letting you know when it's time to upshift, presumably to maximize your fuel economy. That was probably ignored frequently. But you also have your typical warning lights in here, like your oil light and your battery light, in case there's problems with those things. However, you also have a random extra bank of warning lights right here in the dashboard. The warning lights for the seatbelt, the brakes, and the parking brake are all mounted here, separate from the gauge cluster, separate from the other warning lights. Rather odd. Now, also in this vicinity, of course, you can see the Blaupunkt radio that's probably original to this car. Looks very fitting, this 911 from this era. And you can also see directly above that, you have a few controls. Specifically on the left, you have your window defroster, makes sense. Then you have the fog lights. Then you have your cigarette lighter, as you can see. And then you have an unlabeled button. That's actually not a button at all. It is the switch, the dial that opens up the glove box. It is sized and positioned like a control button, but it is in fact the glove box latch. It's kind of an odd decision to do that, but again, they were quirky. It's just what they did. And speaking of weird things to open things, to the left of the steering wheel, how about this little circle? What exactly does that do? Well, it's a latch that you pull to open up the fuel door. You pull it and the fuel door on the front fender pops open and you can put in your fuel. And hidden within this fuel door is a little piece of rolled up vinyl that you can unroll when you're filling up your car to make sure that the fuel filler or gasoline doesn't get on your paint, which actually I think is kind of a cool idea. Our last interesting quirk up front here is the steering wheel itself, which you can see is a regular wheel, but then it has 2 horizontal bars going across, and then in the center you have your horn pad. It says Porsche, and you press in the middle and that's your horn. Not exactly the world's most attractive attractive steering wheel, if we're being honest, but it did fit in with the rest of this interior, which was sort of a pretty functional, basic, horizontal situation. By the way, one interruption to that functional, basic, horizontal situation, on the lower part of the dashboard, you can see there's a panel kind of separated out. That is your ashtray. You push it down, and that's where you could put out your cigarette butts. Very important to the Germans in the 1980s that you had an easily accessible ashtray, and so you do, positioned closer to you than the air conditioning controls. As for the back seats, they're really not all that interesting, aside from being incredibly small. You fold the front seat forward, you can see, get access to the back seats. You have two seats back here, two individual bucket seats, and you can't really put people back there, but you could imagine putting people back there, and so it makes you feel a little bit like you're buying a more practical car than just a regular two-seater. At least it has rear seats, even if they're rather unusable. Now, there is one nice use case for the rear seats. You can fold down the seat backs and reveal the back of the seat is carpeted, and it folds flat to give you a carpeted storage area back here where you can stick stuff and put anything that doesn't fit in the front trunk. Yes, the front trunk. It's a hallmark of the Porsche 911 for decades, and of course, this vehicle has it. You open up the front trunk, there's a little latch in the driver's footwell you pull, and then you go around to the front, unlatch it, open it up, and you can see the front trunk. Now, this particular front trunk in this model is not as deep as the front trunks in later 911s. It goes further down, but it's pretty long. It's like just flatter and longer than what you'd get in newer 911 models. You do have a pretty decent amount of storage space up here if you've maxed out what's behind the seats. And another interesting item, lift up the carpet in the front trunk and you have a tire, a spare tire, which 911 models in modern days definitely don't have. The wheels have just gotten too big, but back in this era, you could still get a spare tire with your 911. Other interesting thing in the front trunk, on the inside of the trunk lid underneath, you have the famous Porsche label, which shows everything about the vehicle, the VIN, the type of 911 that it is, and also it lists all of the options configured to this car, including the original factory color code, so you know exactly how this car was equipped when it left the factory in Zuffenhausen. Anyway, that is your basic tour of the quirks and features of the old school air-cooled 911, and now it's time to get this car out on the road. Let's see how it drives. All right, driving the old school 911. This is an interesting car to drive. I've never driven one of these before. A 911 from this era. I have driven a lot of 964s, a lot of 993s, a lot of 996s, but I've even a 930, which was kind of the turbo version of this car. But I've never driven one of these. And I have to say, getting in the car, it's interesting to me. The 911, in my mind, has become known so much for being this like practical, usable, easy to use, like agreeable, eager sports car. And it wasn't quite like that back in the day. This car is very different from a 993 or a later 911 in a lot of ways. But a big one is the fact that it's just not quite as easy to operate as those vehicles are. The clutch in this car is a lot heavier and a lot less smooth than what I'm used to in 993 and you know, later 911s. Same deal with the shifter. The shifter's got more play and longer throws, but probably the thing that surprises me the most, certainly the thing that's most impactful to me, is that I don't really fit all that well in this car. And I actually usually, even though I'm tall, I usually fit in most cars just because like the way my body is proportioned. But this particular car is tough. My knee is right up against the gear lever, and usually when that's the case, it's because the steering wheel is too far forward. I move the steering wheel back, I can move my knee over. Not the case here because the steering wheel is fixed, and so gear lever, especially in first, is kind of always impacting my knee, which is sort of causing me more to start in second. Now, the things that this car has that I am used to from a 911, very familiar sound, very familiar driving feel, a relatively little, compact, you know, tossable, usable car. That's what this feels like. Clearly pretty well built. I mean, even though it's a little bit less comfortable than later 911 models, it's a well-built car. It does feel like well put together and solid in here. Not a lot of creaks and rattles. Obviously, the interior is laid out in this sort of solid, no-nonsense, you know, function over form way. The other thing about this car is it's not incredibly fast. You know, back in the day, it probably was pretty fast. This powertrain, you know, in coming out of the 80s, the late 70s and the 80s, a lot of cars just were not that good. They were not that fast. They were not that fun. They were not that desirable. And this was one of the few bright spots in that era. I mean, even the Ferrari 308 was basically about at this car's level in terms of power. After the era of the 60s and muscle cars, there just were not that many really good high performers. So by today's standards, it's pretty slow. You got to really ring it out, but the engine does feel very eager and very excited for you to ring it out. Very smooth, feels very reliable, well built. You're not worried that something's going on and you're having some problem back there. It also feels very smooth throughout the entire rev range, which is great. Revs well and relatively easy, so it's pretty easy to rev match, although again, the clutch pedal is surprisingly punishing. I mean, the car does feel like a fun little eager sports car, which was always the case with the 911. It just definitely feels like an older iteration of that, with this longer throw shifter and the tighter interior, the fixed steering wheel, and it simply is not kind of the vehicle that evolved later, which became sort of the sports car that everyone could love. This definitely is more of a 70s, 80s car in terms of a little bit more compromise. Now, it's funny because when I get in other 70s, 80s sports cars, they're way more compromised than this. So probably relative to the cars of its day, this was a pretty good performer, which by today's standards, it isn't really. And this was like actually a pretty practical, usable, easy to drive car, which again, to me, it doesn't quite have that feel now, especially compared with the 911s that followed. But for the era, it is a very excellent car. Overall, I think I would say that I understand why people enjoy these cars so much. They have sort of this, they have this amazing, you know, old school, wonderful look, and they have this feel that you know, it's like a nice little kind of tossable car that just made you feel like a good driver, made you feel like it was well built, unlike so many cars from its era. I do think the 964 and 993 are surprisingly better. Like, I don't think I realized just how much of an improvement those cars were, given that they were basically iterations on the same thing. They weren't like total full redesigns like the 996 was. But there is still a lot to like here, and it does give you such a classic, wonderful kind of old school driving experience. That's what people who like these cars are after, and that's exactly what this car provides in its sort of uniquely Porsche way, where you can see a lot of the DNA that carries on to later 911 models right here in this car. You can see, you know, what made this car so special in its day, and what was, you know, carried on, and why people enjoyed it so much, and why later models kind of got where they got. This car gives you a good starting point, and it's pretty clear to see. And so that's the old school Porsche 911 Targa, the air-cooled 911. This car may not be the fastest or the most comfortable by modern standards, but it's analog and cool in a way that a lot of people absolutely love. And you can buy this 911 on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give this Targa a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 48 out of 100, which places the 1985 911 here against some similar cars. These old 911 models are cool, but a bit compromised compared to newer cars. They're not as comfortable or as fast as 911 models that followed directly after. Regardless, an old 911 is an enjoyable, old-school, analog car that looks cool and offers excellent build quality, and it's easy to see why so many people like them.